Alright guys, good morning. Let's go get started. Hopefully you guys are all staying warm. It's very cold out there. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start talking about HTML today. So if you missed last week, we talked about HTTP, talked about kind of the protocol, the communication that's used for websites. So we've talked about how the client and the server talk to each other, specifically via the HTTP protocol. We talked about HTTPS. That stuff is mostly background information for you guys. We're not implementing HTTP as a protocol in our websites. You could if you want to, but that's way outside the scope of this class. The browsers do that for us, and our computers do that for us. So we're going to start talking about how we actually get website information from the client to, or from the server to the client. How is this data transferred, or specifically, what kind of data is it? How do we render a page from the server? So we're going to talk about HTML. So really three basic technologies that are used for websites. The first is HTML, stands for Hypertext Markup Language. This provides the structure and the content of a web page. Really important. These things aren't bolded, but by the way, you should probably know the difference between these three and what each of them provide. So HTML provides the structure and the content. When we talk about HTML, we're talking about structure and content. Hence, markup language. So HTML isn't really a programming language in this general sense. We don't have logic in HTML. We don't have, conditionals. We don't have loops. We don't have any programming features. It's a markup language. So it's a way for us to take some content and we mark it up with the different tags that we have available to us to give some structure to the content, to give some meaning to the content. So when we talk about HTML, content and structure. CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, is how we will provide the styling to our content. We'll talk about what cascading means. We'll dig into CSS probably next week, maybe the week after that. And then JavaScript is an actual programming language. It's a scripting language that provides interactivity and dynamic features. So anything where stuff happens when you click on it, any kind of fetching data behind the scenes, any kind of loading new data, any kind of interactivity or dynamic features are going to be provided by JavaScript. So those are the three main technologies that make up websites. There are a few additional things we could talk about. Java can be embedded in a website, although it's not near as common now as it was in the past, mainly because of security issues. Same goes for like ActiveX and even Silverlight, which was Microsoft's kind of dynamic scripting language that is even now not really as supported. So really, for the most part, there's probably some stats we could look up, but probably 90 to 95% of websites are all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There are some still that will use some of these extra features. Flash, for instance, was really popular when I was learning web development. We did a lot of Flash stuff. Because of security issues, we don't use Flash anymore, and a lot of other issues with Flash. So really at this point, we're just talking HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Those are all powerful enough on their own that any kind of cool features, we don't need to bring in weird third-party additions. These are all native, built into the browser. You don't have to install extra components or plugins to make them work. Your browser downloads the HTML from the web server, and then the HTML itself includes the CSS and the JavaScript. So that's a pretty important thing. When you make a web request, what you're doing is you're downloading the HTML, and then the HTML will contain links. It may have some CSS or some JavaScript embedded inside it, and we'll talk about that, but it also will contain links to external files that your browser will then go and download as well. But the very first thing it has to get is your HTML file, and that provides the sources for your JavaScript and your CSS. You can kind of look at this if we go to google.com, and if you open up the inspector, by the way, we'll talk about the inspector a lot. I always just right-click on the page and do inspect element, but you can also do like, this is in Safari, but like view, or maybe it's, I don't even know where it is. Oh, develop, and then like show web inspector or JavaScript console. But once you have it open, there's all these different tabs here you can go to. We'll look specifically at the network one, which will show us all the different network calls that have been made after we load the HTML. So the very first thing we do is load the HTML. Again, on Thursday last week, we looked at our curl request, and it returned a ton of HTML. That's what our initial request gets. But then the HTML includes other links we have to go download, and that's where all of this stuff comes from. So if we go to all, we don't want to just see the JavaScript. But you'll see, here's our first document. Here's all the HTML, and it says here on the right, that's just the document. And then that document included links to all of these other files. We've got some JavaScript, we've got some image files, there's going to be some other HTML files in there. Eventually we'd see some CSS in there as well. I think I've got some stuff filtered somehow, but anyway, so with that network tab, you can see all the other resources that your browser is having to pull in and all the other network requests it's having to make. Okay, so to talk real quick about kind of the difference between what we call static sites and dynamic sites. So static sites is mostly what we're going to work with in this class until the very end, where we'll do some client-side rendering. So we'll do some more dynamic sites when we're dealing with React and JavaScript. But static sites are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that just exist on a server, and our browser downloads them and displays them, right? So there's nothing really ever changing about those HTML files or the JavaScript files. They're just kind of static files that we can access. We also refer to this as the front end or the client side. So if you ever hear front end versus back end, the front end is kind of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Dynamic sites will use some sort of software hosted on the web server to generate the HTML for the page. So if you think of like WordPress or something like that, there's not just an HTML file. If I go to some WordPress blog, that's not just an HTML file that exists on a server. That's WordPress, the software, is running whenever I make a request to joesblog.com. It's running PHP and WordPress is running, and it's generating the HTML through that request. So that's what we would call a dynamic site. That's anytime there's some software on a server that's generating the page for you. Really, it's having to generate HTML to return that to the client, but it's more than just a simple HTML file. Kind of outside the scope of this class, we're not going to do any dynamic generation. The 330, you may deal with that with PHP or Java. You can do dynamic sites with things like that. So also that software, the server that's running, is typically what we consider the backend. So anything running on a server that's using actual programming languages, that's interacting with databases, things like that, that's the backend of our application, or the server side. So again, examples, any sites with login or e-commerce typically are dealing with dynamic sites, anything using PHP or ASP.NET, Java, etc. It does get a little bit trickier now that what we call client-side rendering is a lot more popular. So with technologies like React, we're actually kind of blending these a little bit because I've got a React site that I'm working on right now, and it really is just an HTML and a JavaScript and a CSS file. There's no server-side rendering happening. It all happens in the client. So it kind of becomes something of a mix, but we would still consider it dynamic because JavaScript itself is rendering the page. If I go to mywebsite.com/about-me and it's a React site, there's not an HTML file on the server that exactly matches that page that I see. React and our JavaScript is generating it for us kind of on the fly. So it's kind of a little bit of a trickier mix now that server-side or client-side rendering is a lot more popular. But anyway, we'll only really deal with static sites again until we get to React, and then we're doing some more fancier things. One thing to just talk about is WYSIWYG site builder. So WYSIWYG stands for what you see is what you get. Give us some sort of interface like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or something where we can kind of drag and drop and make a website look a certain way that way. So stuff like Adobe Dreamweaver on your computer or Wix or Squarespace, we would all consider WYSIWYG site builders. There's a lot of pros to these. One, anyone can do it. You don't have to be a software engineer or a computer science major to build a website using these tools. So that's really valuable. I have friends that, it's funny, like probably 10 years ago, if I had friends that, hey, I need a website for my band or something, like I would build it for them, HTML, CSS, whatever. Now if people are like, hey, I need a website for, my business down the street or for my band or something like that, I'm like, go to Wix.com and build it yourself, right? Like, because they can do it. It's just easier than me pouring a ton of time and charging them money to build this really custom site. For the most part, it's easier just for really simple sites for people to build it themselves, which is really valuable. People can do it on their own. It's a useful skill to have. There also are plugins now, so you can do e-commerce. I have a friend recently who built a site to sell stuff all on his own, no computer science background at all. He used Squarespace. There was an e-commerce plugin, so he could set it all up, connect it to his bank account, and it all worked great. You can do blogs, things like that. Really cool features now with some of these site builder services. However, there are some cons. It's very limited. Again, you're limited to what they give you. It can be difficult to update. I've dealt with this. I've also done projects, as much as I sometimes point people to these services, I also have had projects where people pay me to build them custom sites to move off of Squarespace. Because I've had clients where they're like, hey, we have this awesome Squarespace site that we built, but anytime we want to change anything or update a blog post, we have to log into it and we have to deal with their interface, and it's really specific. You don't have as good of content management tools. You can't kind of bring in data from other sources. You're really kind of locked into their experience. So I've had lots of projects where once they kind of outgrow what Wix or Squarespace gives them, okay, it's time to build a real website and time to be able to have some more flexibility to pull in data from external sources, etc. It also doesn't generate clean code. So a lot of times, when they're giving you all of the possible options, Dreamweaver is really bad about this. Although it may be better, there's newer versions than when I was, learning and would use Dreamweaver some. But if you can drag and drop stuff, everything's going to be very pixel oriented. If you move something 10 pixels to the right, it's going to have to position that. It's just, doesn't end up with very clean code. It's so verbose because they have to give you so many options. It's not a great solution. Again, because they're trying to be able to do everything. Which is just not going to work very well. Here's an example with Wix. So again, you can just kind of drag and drop and type stuff, and it works. This is kind of what Dreamweaver looks like. So Dreamweaver at least will show you your HTML. You can kind of drag and drop, and it'll kind of show you the changes that it's made, that kind of thing. So again, useful tool within the right context. Also talk about content management systems. So this is software that will run on the server and gives us a system to manage the content of our page. So again, we're dealing now with a dynamic site. So this is something like WordPress or Drupal, Tumblr even to some degree would be considered a content management system, where it's software that's built to manage your content. So you can have content writers and content editors log into the system, create their content there, publish their content there. They never have to think about editing the HTML files for the website, right? They can publish the content within WordPress, and then our HTML and JavaScript takes over and displays that appropriately, and our PHP or whatever the behind the scenes is. So again, lots of pros. It's easy to manage, so really great. Whenever I have someone who wants a blog, I almost always set them up with WordPress or some other content management system, because then they don't write their blog post and send it to me and then I add it to their HTML. They can just write it right within WordPress. Good for like discussion boards or e-commerce. A lot of times you can purchase themes that are plug and play. So I've got a buddy who got his start in web development by building WordPress sites, and he would purchase themes and then kind of customize those, and it worked really great. You can add plugins for added functionality. So if you want a Twitter feed on your WordPress blog, you can do that with a few clicks and add a Twitter plugin or whatever. So really nice. There are some cons difficult to set up. If you've ever tried to install WordPress on a server or Drupal on a server, it can be really complicated and really difficult, especially if you have to then go and do updates or something like that, or move it to a different server. It really gets very complicated very quick, because again, it's doing so much for you that it's a very complex system. Also, again, limiting in features. You can only do what they provide for you to do. Here's a screenshot of WordPress if you've never seen it. Again, you've got your posts, you've got your kind of Microsoft Word-like controls, like your content writers can make things bold and stuff and not worry about what the HTML is doing behind the scenes. So after I've kind of, sold you on how great these other tools are for making websites, why are you here, right? Why are we learning HTML and CSS and JavaScript and things behind the scenes? Again, there's lots of options for configurable websites. All of them boil down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. At the end of the day, whether a website was built with Dreamweaver or Squarespace or Wix or WordPress or whatever, there's HTML and CSS and JavaScript being delivered to the browser. That's the technology that they're using to display the web page. So by understanding that technology, one, it helps us use these tools better or understand their purpose a little bit better, because we understand what they're doing behind the scenes. We understand how they're creating the HTML. Even just having some basic HTML and CSS knowledge is helpful when you're doing WordPress development, because you can kind of customize templates. You can write some custom CSS in some of the WordPress theme stuff to sort of customize things. So it kind of opens up some new doors when you're dealing with some of these tools. But then also we want to build better tools, right? Like we want to build the next WordPress. We want to build the next Wix, because these tools aren't going to be around forever. They're kind of siloed and specific. We want to understand how they work and understand the technologies behind the scenes so that we can make better ones. That's what we're here for. We're not here to make websites the easiest way. We're here to really understand how they work. But I want you to be familiar with those tools because, again, in my kind of personal consulting business, whenever people come to me with a website, I kind of have to decide, okay, is this a solution that really makes more sense for you to go build a Wix page yourself? Does it make sense for me to build you a custom HTML and CSS page? Does it make sense for me to build you a custom WordPress page with a custom theme? You kind of have to make these decisions based on the business needs. If it's someone who has a $100 budget, okay, probably go build your own Wix page. If they have, a different budget, maybe we can work something out. If they have crazy content needs and I've got 20 different people that are going to write blog posts and I need to enable comments and I need to have image uploads and all this kind of stuff, okay, that screams WordPress to me. Let's build a WordPress page and figure out from there. So understanding all the options really kind of helps you evaluate how to best fill the need based on the options that are available. Okay, so HTML, initially invented around 1989 by Tim Berners-Lee. Was the guy who invented HTML. He's still around. He's doing some cool stuff with kind of a new, more distributed internet, by the way. might Google his name if you kind of want to read about that. HTML was actually invented at CERN. Have any of you ever heard of CERN, or the Large Hadron Collider? It's a particle research facility in Switzerland, I think, where they collide particles and examine what happens. It's really interesting to me that it was invented there. So HTML was invented by academics and scientists doing research as a way for them to share data back and forth and to collaborate. The internet, by the way, really first was created and first started to grow amongst research institutions. So the first internet was like 4 or 5 schools or research institutions that had connected together to create this internet. Okay, they have a connection now. How do we share data amongst one another? How do we share research amongst one another? And that's where HTML came from. It was a way for them to publish papers and to publish research for other institutions to then consume, for the public to consume, to publish in papers, that kind of thing. Really fascinating to me that that's kind of where it came from. HTML wasn't the only kind of format, by the way. There were a few competing formats for data at the time when the internet was first getting started, but HTML really won out with it pretty quickly, too, within a few years. So really, HTML is the only format now that we'll use over the internet. The HTML specification is maintained by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, which is just kind of an institution, a consortium of a lot of different companies and governments. So you'll see, people from Google and Apple and Microsoft make up the W3C government representatives. It's kind of a collective group that votes and decides how to govern the HTML specification. Important to note, too, it's a specification for HTML. So the W3C doesn't publish software that runs HTML. What they publish is really long documents that describe what HTML is and describe what HTML should do. And from there, it's up to the browser implementers to implement that specification. So that's why we see some slight variances sometimes between browsers, is because HTML really is just a standard, and the browser vendors themselves have to implement that standard. And sometimes the standard, long as it may not be totally clear on certain things. They may say, okay, LI should be displayed this certain way, but maybe there's some room for interpretation in the standard. And so that's where we start to see these slight differences in the way that browsers will do things. Maybe the standard doesn't include a certain use case, and so the browser just kind of chooses what to do there. HTML4, which is kind of still kind of the current version, was finalized around 1999, and then HTML5 has been finalized for about 2 years, probably 3 now, since I last updated these slides. Browsers are still kind of catching up with HTML5. It's not, it's tough. It's like 99% adopted at this point. Most HTML features are safe to use. Really, the only thing we're still worried about is IE 8 and 9 sometimes have some things that don't work super well with HTML5. There are a few parts of HTML5 too that I think aren't totally adopted yet, but browsers are still kind of catching up. For the most part, we use HTML5 pretty safely in any professional sense these days. But just so you know, that's kind of where we're at. HTML4 has been around for quite a while. HTML5 is pretty much done, but the browsers are still kind of catching up in their implementation of it. So we'll talk about HTML5 and some specific tags and stuff as we go along. Okay, so the first part of our HTML is called the doc type. So again, because HTML has evolved over time, again, we're on version 5 now, there's all the way back to version 1. The doc type is how we indicate which version of HTML we're using. So it tells the browser, okay, here's a version of HTML, and the browser will follow certain rules when it's rendering that. HTML5 really makes it very easy. They changed the way the doc type works to just make it doc type HTML. We're a lot less concerned with HTML5 about backwards compatibility because in theory, everything will be backwards compatible from here on out, so we don't have a need for a specific doc type anymore. But I want you to be familiar with it, one, because the doc type is still required, so we have to include a doc type with HTML is the very first thing in our HTML file. Again, it's what identifies the file to your browser and the HTML version. So really important that the doc type is the very first thing in our HTML file. And this is what an HTML4 doc type looks like, by the way. If you see this, you'll kind of understand what it is. So obviously we see it's a W3C, it's HTML, 4.01, transitional, and this is where things get kind of crazy. With prior versions of HTML, there were sort of different interpretation rules. Here we're using loose. There was also strict, so you could tell the browser whether to kind of be a little more flexible or to be really strict. Really was kind of messy. No one really enjoyed dealing with all of that, so they've really simplified it, doctype HTML. We use doctype HTML pretty much across the board at this point, so there's not really much reason to ever use an HTML4 doc type unless you really need to support older versions of IE, which at this point we really don't. So doctype HTML should always be at the very first thing in your HTML file. Comments in HTML. So if you've done any programming, you understand comments are ways that we can add some sort of contextual comments to our code. Comments in HTML look different than Java is going to be // in HTML, we use the angle bracket, exclamation point, and then 2 dashes. It's kind of annoying. I don't really like the format, but it works. And then we use 2 dashes in your closing angle bracket to close the comment. So good, we should use comments very often in our code. I like to use comments kind of between large sections of my HTML, different sections of my page. I like to use comments whenever I've done anything that isn't self-evident of why I've done it. So if I do something a little bit different than normal or something that may look a little bit strange, I'll include a comment as a note to my future self when I'm coming back years later trying to understand why I did something the way that I did. Having that comment there will be a huge benefit. It's also good for future developers who are going to take over after you. Leaving comments is really, really helpful. The worst thing is finding a comment in a code that's like, why am I doing this? Or this doesn't work, or something like that. That's happened to me in my day job. I'll find comments that says, this doesn't work. Okay, great. Why doesn't it work? What does it do? Is it important? If it doesn't work, why is it here? Is it safe to delete? There's a lot of information there that's missing when you just say it doesn't work. So be pretty descriptive in your comments. A few notes. One, comments can be seen when you do view source or when you open the inspector. So don't ever put anything sensitive or private in your comments. Don't put a default password, anything like that in your comments. That's one of the first things that pen testers or hackers will check when they're doing a security audit or trying to break into your website is they'll look at your source and see if there are any comments. One of the recent breaches, I think the big Equifax breach a year and a half ago, part of it was due to some default passwords that were in comments. So it's a real thing. People do that, and it's the first thing that any hacker is going to look for is for some sort of password in your comments. So don't leave sensitive information in your comments. We can also comment out a line of code if you want to temporarily remove it. I do this all the time just as part of my development process. If I'll try something, it doesn't quite work, I'll comment that line out, put a comment around it, and try something else, but I've still got that there, it's only temporarily removed. If I change my mind and go back to it, I can always uncomment. So usually command / or control / as a shortcut will comment things out. You can even highlight groups of things. So, if I've got, a file, this is JavaScript, so it's going to look kind of different. But if I say, okay, I want to comment this whole thing out, I can select that command /. Again, it's JavaScript, so it's a little bit different, but it'll comment all of those lines that I've highlighted, or then I can uncomment them. So, useful. Okay, so HTML, again, stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Language used to describe the content of our web page. HTML is composed of elements, which include an opening tag and a closing tag. So we'll talk about HTML elements, which is the full element, including the opening tag and the closing tag. And the element is kind of referencing the whole thing. The closing tag is identified by a / at the beginning. So this is what an HTML element looks like. we've got our opening tag or our start tag. Angle brackets go around our tags. So we've got our angle bracket with the tag name, closing angle bracket, then some contents in the tag or in the element. So these are just some text, or it could be more HTML. It could be other elements inside of this HTML element. Then we close it with a slash. So whenever you see the slash and then the tag name, that's the closing tag for that HTML tag. So ultimately, our web pages are made up of lots of different elements. We've got headings, or paragraphs, or lists, or divs, etc. And we often kind of have a hierarchy of our information. So if you think of, like, I always like to use like a newspaper as an example. If you think of a newspaper, you've kind of got a hierarchy to your information, right? You've got a title, you've got like a main heading and an article following it. Even within an article, you may have subheadings, you may have images with captions, you may have a footer with, authorship information. You've got kind of a structure or a hierarchy to that information, right? We want to think of web pages the same way, because that's kind of how HTML is built. So again, HTML was created for research papers. It was created for really text-heavy documents that had a lot of structure to them, lots of headings, lots of different sections. They had some hierarchy to the research paper. So again, it really helps to kind of get in this space when we're talking about HTML, because HTML is kind of built this way. So again, we'll have headings with subheadings, we'll have lists with nested lists, etc. So the HTML tags surrounding the content is how we kind of give that structure to our page. So we nest elements inside of one another, and then the nesting of those elements is what's providing the structure. So if we have a heading, and then after that's a paragraph, but both of those things are inside a div, that div saying, hey, these things are kind of grouped together as an item, that kind of thing. So we nest elements within one another. Show some examples here in a little bit. So first, some required elements that every page has to have. The first is the HTML tag. So again, after our doc type, which should be the very first thing, the entire web page is wrapped by an HTML tag or an HTML element. It's just a way of saying this is HTML. Following that, the head tag comes just after the HTML and contains information about the page, so kind of meta information. We'll use meta tags even. So head is all stuff that's not going to be visible on the page. So anything inside your head element is not visible on the page. It's just kind of header information. That's where we'll provide links to our CSS, links to our JavaScript, things like that. The title tag goes inside of the head, and it gives a title to the page. This title doesn't show up on the page itself, but it shows up on the header bar at the very top of the page, or the tab. So here where it says Google up on the tab, that comes from the title element of the page. In fact, if we inspect this and look at elements, we can look at the head. I'm going to make this a little bigger. If we find the title tag here, Google, we could say Kraig's Google. And then we see that the tab is updated. It's cutting it off because I've got so many tabs open. But whatever is in that title tag is what shows up there in the tab. Or if there are no tabs, or if you're in Windows, it'll be on like the header maybe, up on the top. After the closing head tag, we have the body tag. So the body tag is what contains what will actually be shown on the page. So again, body comes after the closing head, and it wraps everything that appears in the main browser window. So anything we're actually displaying on the page will show up in the body tag. So all of these are required in an HTML page. So the HTML specification requires that you have all of these tags present. We have to have HTML tag wrapping everything. We have to have a head tag that has to include a title. That's the only thing that has to be inside your head, but you have to have a title. And then we have a body. Again, all required. So again, here's just a really basic example without a doc type, which we do need, but this is kind of a minimum HTML page. So we've got our HTML that wraps the entire thing. We've got our head up at the top that includes a title tag. And then we've got our body, which includes the stuff that is actually displayed on the page. Here you can see, by the way, how we'll kind of indent tags that are nested, which I really like to do as a general rule. You don't have to, but I like to have anything that's nested indented just so it's a little bit more visually apparent that it's inside of another tag. Also helps you track your closing tags and make sure you have everything closed properly. If you indent it, it'll be a little more visually obvious when you don't. Okay, so next are element attributes. So attributes are how we can provide some additional information about the contents of an element. So it appears in the opening tag. It has a name and a value for the attribute. And the value typically is wrapped in quotes. So generally, attributes don't do anything on their own. There are a few attributes that will change the way that the browser does something. But typically, we're using attributes in our CSS and our JavaScript to then modify them from there. So a lot of the attributes we'll talk about at first, ID and class and things like that, they don't really do anything on their own, but we'll use them very heavily within our CSS and our JavaScript. So they're really important, but until we get into CSS and JavaScript, it's not as apparent what we'll use them for. So again, here's what an attribute looks like. We'll have our, again, our opening tag. We then have some attribute name. The space here is misleading. You shouldn't have a space in your attribute name. Always have dashes. Any ones that we'll use are just one word, so it's not as relevant. But so we've got our attribute, and then it equals, and then the value is inside of quotes. So this would be something like ID equals, and then whatever we want the value of that attribute to be. Or class equals, and then whatever the value is that we want. So typically the attribute name here is specific. There are certain attributes that we can use. But the value typically is whatever you want it to be. Questions? Make sense? Okay, we'll show some examples. It'll kind of make sense once we get into CSS as well. So here's an example of a few different attributes that we could use. So here the first is style. Spoiler alert, we won't use the style attribute in class very much, if ever, because it's not the best way to do styling of elements. But I'm showing you here as an example. It is still technically valid HTML, although potentially not for long. Anyway, style is the attribute name. So again, style is a specific attribute that's in the specification for HTML that we're allowed to use. And then in the value, we put the style that we want to apply. In our case, font size is 10 pixels is the style that we're applying. Here we've got an ID. So again, it's an attribute. It's on the opening tag. And then whatever that main could be whatever it is that we want, whatever ID we want to give that element. There we've got a class. Here we've got a source where we're providing the URL to an image. Where we've got an alt where we're providing some additional sort of alternative text for the image. We'll talk more about some of those attributes, but that's what it looks like to use an attribute. So again, just a few things. View source lets us see the HTML of any website on our browser. So different ways to do it in Chrome or Firefox. Safari is different as well. View source just will show you the HTML itself, all of the HTML. You can. Sometimes I like to do view source if I want to kind of browse all of the HTML. Developer tools, every browser now has developer tools built in, including an inspector, which lets you kind of change the HTML as you go, kind of see it a little more interactively, which I really like. Again, developer tools has changed web development. When I first did web development, we didn't have the inspector. Now we do. It almost feels like cheating because of how powerful it is. A lot of times I'll do my development in the inspector. I'll write my HTML or I'll do styling until I get things how I want it to look, and then I'll pull those into my HTML and CSS files. Really, really powerful that you get live view of your HTML and your CSS. So really value. Again, to open it, you can usually just right-click and do inspect element. And what's nice there too is it'll focus on a specific element. So I'll show you, examples. So here's developer tools. Again, there's these different tabs. Here we've got elements. Console is really useful as well when we get into JavaScript. So when you right-click on something and do inspect element, our inspector opens up to that element itself. So that's opened up directly to that link. See here, wherever the text is, this is just insane. Google's a really bad example because their HTML is just absolutely insane. Let's open up WashU's website because that's going to be better. If you ever want to look at really complicated HTML, look at Google or Facebook is almost worse. So like if we say, okay, let's see what kind of element this text here uses. Let's see what kind of HTML tag we have. So we'll inspect it and it will jump to it. So we see that's an H2, it's a heading. It's got a class, so this is an attribute with an attribute value. And then we see some text inside of that element, and then we have our closing element. So again, you can even see, we'll talk about divs in a little bit, but you can see all the different ways that the HTML is nested, and it kind of creates some structure by the way it's nested. Again, I'll just kind of, inspector's awesome. If you just double click, we can change any of this. We could change this to intro 2 if we wanted to. We'll notice the styles change because it no longer has that class. We can change the text. Say you are Washington University. That's now displayed on the page. We can change the style over here. So we can see not only what styles are applied, we can see where they come from. There's a file called homepage.scss that provides these styles. We won't really talk about SCSS too much. But if we want to, we can go through and just uncheck these. So, I don't want it to have font weight 500 anymore. Or I want to remove this padding. You can just uncheck. We can also edit this. So we could change, text transform to uppercase. Now it's all uppercase. We can do anything that we can do in CSS, we can do right here in the inspector, change the way the page looks. Side note, this is why you should never trust a screenshot of a web page to be an accurate reflection of what the web page actually shows, because anyone can modify a web page and take a screen. I could change this to something offensive and take a screenshot of it and email and say, hey, look what the WashU web page says. So don't trust screenshots because anyone can alter them. We can even drag and drop elements. So if we wanted to move this H2, if you just kind of click and hold, now we can move it somewhere else. So we can move it up, before this div. So now it's up here somewhere. All kinds of stuff you can do. You can edit as HTML. Again, it's whatever you want to do. You can also do. We'll talk more about this when we do CSS, but you can toggle different states as well. It's a little bit different in each one. Sometimes, like in here, we can right-click and I can say for pseudo classes like hover. So now it looks like I'm hovering over it, even though I'm not, which is nice for kind of doing styling and modifying and stuff like that. Again, inspector, super, super useful. I do a lot of my actual active development in the inspector because it's just kind of easier because you can see those changes real time. If I'm trying to determine the exact font size to use, let's say for this link, font size 10 pixels, say, okay, that's too small. I just hit the up and I can just kind of step through different font sizes until I find the right one. Then, okay, cool. I know what font size to use now. Much easier than guessing and then going to your page and checking and then changing your CSS file and changing it. You can kind of do this to find the exact values that you need and then pull that into your files. Again, inspector is kind of cheating as far as web development goes. Here's a screenshot of the inspector that I just showed you. This is some HTML. Not sure why that's there. Let's talk about a couple of the different elements we have available to us. So kind of the first class of elements is text elements. So these are elements that only have text inside of them, and they provide some structure to that text. Really minimal styling by default from the browser for these text elements. So all of the HTML that we'll talk about, almost no styling applied to the elements by default. all the style that will apply via our CSS. I'll show you an example in a minute of like what the WashU website would look like without any CSS. It's going to look extremely basic. You guys have all probably seen a website that's just black and white, just text, no positioning. If the CSS is broken or something like that, you'll just see black and white, just really plain, no styling. That's what the browser will do by default without any additional styling. So all these text elements, there's some really minimal styling. For instance, headings will be larger and they'll be bold, but that's about it. Paragraphs will get a new line, things like that, but really, really minimal styling by default. So the first is headings. HTML has 6 levels of headings, H1 through H6, so H2, H3, so on and so forth. The different size headings will be styled by default as different font sizes. And then eventually they're no longer bold as well. I think like H1 through H3 is bold, and then 4, 5, and 6 aren't, something like that. So again, it's kind of ordered from largest to smallest. So H1 is the largest, should be used for your main headings, and then H6 would be the smallest. An important note about headings is that we want them to be structured. So when we think about our headings, we don't want to just choose the level of heading based on the font size we want, because we can apply those styles on our own in our CSS, but we want to choose the level of heading appropriate for our content. We don't want to only use H1s because, again, if you're thinking about a newspaper, the H1 might be your main heading, and then your following headings are all smaller than that. They're all nested. They're all lower in your hierarchy than your main heading. So typically, we want our headings to be structured. That also means we don't want to jump from an H1 to an H4, because we really should have an H1, and then we can have an H2, and then maybe some H3s under that H2, so on and so forth. We don't want to just jump around, because again, we're not choosing the tag to use based on the style we want to apply. We're choosing the tag to use based on the structure of our content. So we want to really be cautious. That's why there's not infinite headings. There's only 6, because really you may get more than 6 levels deep in a structured document, but probably not. That should be sufficient. So again, it'll work. This is just kind of HTML best practices, and there are some SEO reasons that we want to use structured headings. The Google kind of likes things better. It uses the level of our heading to kind of determine the structure of our page and figure out what the content is like. So it's pretty important. But your HTML is going to work either way. You can have H6s only and they'll still display. But we want to make sure that we're thinking about the structure of our content when we're figuring out which headings to use. So again, don't have an H2 unless you already have an H1 and that H2 is actually a subheading under the H1. That kind of thing. After that, we have paragraphs. So paragraph tags wrap individual paragraphs of text. They'll be separated by a line break and a little bit of margin. So again, think of paragraphs in a newspaper. How are they styled? They're on a new line, and they're maybe separated just a little bit. So a paragraph tag or a P tag is how we'll do that. Bold and italic. So the B tag will make text appear bold by default, and the I tag will make text appear italic. There's some better options that we'll talk about in a little bit, but there are some valid reasons to use bold and italic. You can kind of read about the differences there. We have superscript and subscript. So superscript would be like EMC squared, something like that. Subscript would be something where it's down below the main letters. We don't really use these very often, but they do exist for you. A note about white space. So browsers will collapse all white space within an HTML document. So white space meaning spaces, new lines, things like that. We can have as many spaces as we want in our HTML, as many new lines as we want. The browser really doesn't care. It collapses all of that. So just to kind of illustrate this, if we go back to our WashU page here, let's go like, let's refresh to undo our breaking fixes. Let's go here to this heading. Oops. So let's say we wanted, some more space between this heading and the paragraph there. So, we might say edit this HTML. So here's our H2 and here's our paragraph. We might say, okay, well, let's create some space here. Let's hit enter a few times, create some space, right? If we click away from this, we'll notice nothing happens. That space is still there in our HTML document, but nothing's actually happening on the page, and that's because the HTML collapses all of that white space. It doesn't care how that works. We could also see how that works inside of an element. So if we add a bunch of spaces here inside this heading, well, that did work. So sometimes inside of elements, you'll see that kind of spacing work. But if we hit, well, I can't do, if I do enter, it just confirms the change. But so inside of our, that's why I like the indentation of our tags. We can indent stuff over, and it doesn't make it look indented on our page, right? If we indent, certain tags in our HTML file, those elements aren't indented on the actual page because the HTML, the browser just collapses all that white space. So a few things we can do. One, we have what's called a break tag. So using BR, will insert a line break, and it'll be treated as one space. These are what we call, by the way, empty elements or self-closing tags, where we don't have an opening tag and a closing tag, because there's no content that goes inside of the tag, so it's just the opening and closing tag are combined into one tag. So that's where we have the BR space slash. So BRs will insert a new line. Just show you an example. If we go back to our thing here, and we say, okay, we want a new line. If we edit the HTML here, in between our H2 and our paragraph, we can get rid of all of our manually created new lines. And we can do BR. We'll put 3 of them. And if we click away, now we see that there is that space there because we've used these break tags to add a new line via the tag. So that works. However, we want to use break tags or BRs very sparingly. Honestly, our goal is to never use them. Break tags are kind of a last-ditch effort. There are a few cases where it's valid to use them if we want to separate some stuff. But typically, we don't want to use break tags, especially not to create large empty spaces or margin or things like that. We're going to use our CSS to position things and to create margin and padding and kind of space things out. We don't want to use break tags to do that. So again, in our HTML, we're thinking only of our content and our structure, not the styling, not the positioning, things like that. We'll do that via CSS, so use break tags very sparingly. In fact, really try not to use them. If you have to use a break tag, think if there's some other way to accomplish what it is you're trying to do, like adding some margin with CSS, etc. A HR tag will insert a line break and a horizontal line. So instead of just a new line, it creates a horizontal line as well. There are some valid reasons to use HR if you want to separate different sections of a page. You think of like a newspaper, in between articles, they may have a line or something like that. Those are some valid things to do. So if we go back to our WashU page, if we edit this break tag and we make it a HR, maybe I need to edit it here. We'll get rid of all 3 of these, and we'll set do HR. So now we see that there is a new line, and there's also this horizontal line there as well. So HR stands for horizontal rule. It's just a way of creating a horizontal line. We can even style them a little bit too. So like in your CSS, you can change like the color. You can change, it just uses border bottoms, so we can make it thicker. Or we can change the color of it, things like that. Again, a nice part about the inspector, if you're doing your styling, you've got a color picker, so you can just choose your color, and it'll show it there for you. Super nice. So again, these are empty elements. They don't contain any content, so they're the opening tag and the closing tag are combined. Okay, so semantic elements are not intended to be as much structural, but they're intended to be more meaning-oriented. They're adding some semantics, some context to your content. So they do have some default styling sometimes, but typically we're having to customize them further. The primary purpose, though, is not style. Again, if we understand, a really important thing to understand with HTML is that our HTML should not be style related. Our HTML should be structure and content related. So we're not choosing the elements to create the style we want. We're choosing the elements to create the structure we want. Same goes for semantic elements. So some examples of more semantic elements are strong or emphasis. These are replacements for bold and italic that by default have the same styling, but they have more meaning than just bold or default. Things like quotations or abbreviations, they're more semantic. We're creating some, it's not just structural, but it's more meaning oriented. This is what this content is. This is what this content, what type of content it is. So for strong and emphasis, just strong is how we create a strong tag. It's bold by default, the same as the B tag. I really recommend using strong more often than the B tag, and it's actually replacing the B tag. And if you think about it, the bold tag is more style related. It's saying this should be bold, which is a really specific style that is a little more limiting. Strong, however, can be styled different ways, right? So strong is more referencing that, hey, this is a strong statement in my document, and it may be styled different ways depending on the theme of the website. It might be a different color. It might be less bold. It might be thinner than the rest of our text, and that would still create some strongness to it. It might be bigger, a bigger font size, something like that. We can style it however we want because we don't want our HTML to reference the style. We want our HTML to reference the structure and the meaning of our content. Same goes for emphasis. So EM is an emphasis tag. Again, whenever the emphasis suddenly changes the meaning, it's by default styled as italic. But again, we could style it different ways depending on our theme. So again, I really recommend using strong and emphasis versus bold and italic. Really preferred because they're more descriptive of the meaning of our content and not the style of our content. We'll apply style to them, but it's a little more open-ended. Quotation, so we've got block quote for longer quotes that are more than that take an entire paragraph. So this is something where you've got again, think of your newspaper. You may have a block quote that's kind of inset in your newspaper that's a full paragraph quote that maybe is styled a little bit differently. It's smaller, has a different background color, something along those lines. So that's going to be a block quote. We still probably need to use a paragraph tag inside of our block quote. You could have a block quote that's multiple paragraph tags, but the block quote is just indicating that anything inside that is a quote. We still need to mark up the content inside the quote as well. So it might be a paragraph tag. You might even have a heading inside your block quote, something like that. Q we'll use for shorter quotes that are in line within the paragraph. So this is if you're just quoting inside of a paragraph and it doesn't need a new line. It's not a separate quote from your content. It's just all in line with your content. We can also use the cite attribute if you want to provide a URL with a citation for your quote. So here's an example of a block quote where we've got a citation and we're citing Wikipedia. And inside the block quote, we've got our paragraph, and then we close our block quote. Okay, abbreviations and citations and definitions. So ABBR is used for abbreviations. Again, these, I use block quotes and regular quotes with relative frequency. These I don't use as often, but I want you to at least be familiar with them. So if we want to do an abbreviation, we can indicate that with the ABBR tag. Typically, when you hover over an abbreviation, it'll show the full term in a tooltip, like a pop-up. So if we hovered over the word prof, it would pop up and say professor. I do like to use these if I'm creating a really content-heavy site and I'm using abbreviations. Good idea to use them. We can use cite to list a reference. So by default, they're italicized by the browser. We can also use DFN to explain when we're defining a term for the first time. So think of like a textbook where the first time a term is defined, it'll be bold. We might use the DFN tag for that. This is one where the browsers are kind of split on how they render it. Some of them italicize by default, some don't italicize by default. Just kind of depends. So again, but we're not using it for the style, we're using it for the meaning. So we should be overriding our own styles. So in here we're just defining the internet. We're defining it for the first time in this paragraph, so we want to use the definition tag. I do use the address tag quite a bit. Whenever you want to wrap a physical address or even a phone number, a web URL, any kind of information that could be considered an address of some sort, we can wrap in the address tag. I like to use that a lot just because I feel like it's a good way of saying here's some sort of contact info. Insert and delete we don't use very often, but you can show if you've inserted something or if you're deleting something from a document. Again, these are kind of coming from more research-heavy content where maybe they've changed something, they've edited the document, but they want to still have what the original was in there, but just indicate, hey, this is deleted, this has been inserted, things like that. We use S for strike through. So S stands for strike through. You might use that if you want to show like was $900, now $800 if you're showing a price or something. I'll use strike through to wrap this content that's the old content. You could use, deleted here and inserted here if you really wanted to, but I find it sufficient just to use the strike through. Okay, lists. So we've got a couple different types of lists in HTML. One is ordered lists, where each item begins with a number. We can also change the type. It could be numbered by Roman numerals or some other order types, but think of something like a recipe steps or table of contents, things like that where there's an order to your elements. That's what's going to be an ordered list. We also have unordered lists where each item begins with a bullet point, so it's where the order doesn't really matter. They're not numbered, but they're just bullet pointed. We also have definition lists, which is terms with corresponding definitions. And then we can also nest lists inside of each other. So you could have an ordered list, and the first item in your ordered list has an unordered list in it. Things like that. We can have lists nested. Just like you would if you're taking notes, you can have nested lists and stuff like that. So for ordered lists, we have OL, which wraps the entire list. OL for ordered list, and then LI for list item wraps each item inside of the list. So this is where this HTML would result in this list. So what's nice about this is we don't have to number each item in our actual content. We don't have to say 1 and 2. It's automatically added, so our browser will automatically add that numbering for us. And we can change the style of that numbering. We can change if we want it to be Roman numerals or what kind of margin we want, things like that. But it'll add the numbers for us by default. Unordered list, very, very similar. Instead of OL, we have UL for unordered list. Same thing, we still use list items inside of our list. For definition lists, they're a little bit different. We use DL, which wraps the entire list, definition list. Then we have pairs of DT and DD, where DT is the definition term, and DD, or it's a dictionary, dictionary term and dictionary definition. So I'm actually not a huge fan of the way this works because really all that matters is the order. So a DT followed by a DD, then a DT followed by a DD. I wish they were a little bit more logically grouped than that, but that's the way they chose to do it. Again, here where DT contains the term we're defining, HTML, and then DD contains the definition. Typically, it's styled with the definition indented, so the result will look like this, where we've got HTML, and then the definition is indented to the right. or CSS, and then the definition is indented. Again, that's by default. Any questions so far, by the way? Cool. Okay, so links. A element is used to create links. Anytime we're going to click on a link to go to another page or to download something, the content between the opening A tag and the closing A tag is the clickable part of the link. So whatever the link says goes in between the opening A and the closing A. We use an href attribute to indicate the page it should take us to. So the href gives us the location that the link goes to. So here's an example. We've got A, href equals google.com. Again, the value of the attribute goes in quotes. And then click here is going to be what's visually shown to click on. By default, they're styled as blue and underlined, but once we click them, usually they turn purple to show that we've visited them before. Show an example of a link on the WashU page. If we inspect this guy, we'll see here there's an A, which an href of where the link goes. So that's the link, and then inside it is the actual content. That's what's visible, what you can see. Questions? All right. I don't mind being interrupted, by the way. So if something doesn't make sense or you need me to explain, just throw up your hand or yell at me or something, and I will stop. Okay, one note, absolute URLs versus relative URLs. Something that's kind of easy to get hung up on, pretty important to understand what can go in the href attribute. So when we're linking to a different website, the value of the href needs to be an absolute URL. So an absolute URL is a full web address. It contains our HTTP or HTTPS. It includes the full domain name. It's a fully formed URL. That's an absolute URL that says this is where you should go. The other option when we're linking to a different page within the same site is to use a relative URL, which doesn't include the HTTP, it doesn't include the domain, but it includes a relative path to our current location. So it's kind of a shorthanded address. So for instance, if we have a href that just says aboutus.html, clicking that link will go to whatever website we're currently on /aboutus. So if we're on google.com and we click a link that just has aboutus.html, it'll go to google.com /aboutus.html. So kind of important to understand the difference there. A few more examples. If we have a child folder, you may run into this with websites you build. If you put some files inside of another folder, you can include that in the path. So we might have subpages /aboutus, something like that. We can also use ... to go up a level in our directory structure. So if we're linking to a page that's in a parent folder, we can link to ... /aboutus. So if we're in google.com /subpages/home and we click a link like this, it's going to go to google.com /aboutus without the subpages because it's gone up a level in the directory. So whenever you see ... that's what that's doing, is it's going up a level in the directory. And we can chain multiple of those together. We can do ... /... We want to go up 3 levels in the directory. Make sense? You'll run into this a lot if you're like adding an image to your page and you maybe have an images folder. Then in your image tag, you would use like images/myimage.jpg or whatever it is how you would reference the location of it. Okay, email links. So mail to links will open a user's email program with a new email to the target address. So here we've got an href. To do a mail to link, we just do mail to : and then the email address. And then again, normal link, so we can put whatever text we want inside of the link. And when we click on that, it'll open our email program with the to address already filled in with whatever email address. Just as a tip, I don't like using mail to links that often because for me personally, I use Gmail. Whenever I click on a mail to link on my Mac, it opens up the Mac mail program, which I don't use. You guys may have run into this. And that's kind of annoying. I have to close it. There's like 100 emails open from previous times I've clicked mail to links. And so what my recommendation, my best practice, if I'm going to use a mail to link, I at least put the email address as the text in the link. So I'll have mail to kraighufstedler@gmail.com, but then instead of saying email Kraig, I'll say kraig.hufstedler@gmail.com. So usually people will see it's a link and they'll kind of know they can click that if they want to, but also it's a lot easier to copy and paste that email address. You can right click a mail to link and say copy email address, but that's an extra step. I'd rather just highlight it and copy it. So that's what I like to do, just to provide less annoying interactions for people that maybe don't use whatever the default email program is. You can also use a target attribute to force a link to open in a new window. So if you ever want to make a link instead of redirecting the user from the current page you're on, you want it to open in a new window or a new tab, you can use the target for that. So we use target and then _blank is the value that goes in there if we want it to open in a new tab. There's a few other things you can put there. I think now most browsers don't let you open in a new window, or at least it's a little bit more difficult to, but I think it's _new was for a new window. You can also sometimes name windows or tabs, so you could open it in a specific tab that you've already opened, something like that. So we can look up, if you want to see some of the options, you can look up the target property and see what the other options are. We can also put a # at the end of an href to link to a specific ID element on our page. So kind of two things we can do here. One, we can just do # about us, and it'll link to that section on the page, and it'll actually scroll your browser down to an ID that has that about us. Or we can do an absolute URL and link to google.com # about us, which will jump to that part of that page. I'll illustrate this real quick with the WashU site. If we find some, let's like scroll down to here and see if we can find an ID. Well, it's mostly classes. We'll go ahead and just fix this and say ID equals thought leadership. So now this fix. What did I do here? Okay. So now on this element, I've got this. Why is that not? I guess should be fine. I don't know why it's adding that space in there. This div now has this ID. So if we go up to some link up here, in fact, let's just go ahead and put it in this paragraph. So let's add an a href equals leadership, and we'll say jump to leadership and click out. So now if we go up to where that is, we've got this link, and if we click on it, it should took us to something about my ID down here isn't working. Edit HTML. Oh yeah, good call. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. Oops. Okay, cool. Now we have a proper ID. So now if we click this link, it jumps us down to that section that we have that ID on. So that's where you can have links on your website that will jump to different sections of your website. So again, we've got this URL. If you hover over it, you see it says go to # thought leadership on this page. And if you click it, it jumps down. We can also directly link if this, by the way, changes you make in the inspector don't actually change the HTML on the server, right? It's a temporary change. But if this was real, if that ID really existed, we could send someone a link to washu.edu/thought-leadership, and it would actually take them immediately to that section of that page. So we'll do this a lot with like, sometimes I do this with like documentation or something. If I want to link someone to a specific section of a documentation page, I'll link them to a specific ID, and that way it jumps to write what they need. Okay, pound signs. Let's talk about images. We're not on time. All right, we're almost out of time. So we use the image element to include images. Some of you have already found this out from the bonus points for the assignment. It's an empty element, so it's self-closing, so we don't have a closing image tag, because again, there's no content that goes inside. We use a source attribute to give the URL to the page, so that's required, or the URL to the image. It can be relative or absolute. We also have an alt attribute, which is required, and it provides a text description of the image. So the alt attribute is used whenever the image doesn't load. So if something's broken about your image, or if the image no longer exists, or if it's a screen reader that can't display an image, the alt text is used to provide some additional content. So you have to have an alt tag or an alt attribute now, even if you don't have any description. So if it's just a decorative image, or it's just a graphic used as a separator or something like that, you can have an empty alt attribute. You can say alt equals and then just quotes with no text inside there. But really anything that you have that's an image that's meaningful to your page, you want to provide a description of the image in your alt attribute. So that screen readers, it'll read the alt text aloud since it can't actually display the image. So really important. And again, to meet accessibility requirements, you have to have an alt tag even if there's no text in it. Really important. We also have an optional title attribute, which will provide a tooltip on hover. We don't use it super often, but sometimes you want to provide a title. We can also have figure and fig caption, which will wrap an image and give it a caption. So here's an example. We could just have that image out there. It's got an alt. But then here's an example where we could have a figure that wraps it. So we've got our image. Here's one example where you may use a break tag to have the caption be on a new line from the image. And then we can have a caption that captions the image. So this way we have our image and our caption all within one element that we can then display wherever we want. Okay, the assignment 2 I posted over the weekend and published it, so make sure you take a look at that. It's using a lot of the elements that we've talked about to create a personal bio or a resume. It doesn't have to be about you. It can be about your dog or a famous person or whatever you want. But make sure you look at all the requirements of the tags you're supposed to use. Some of them we may still cover on Thursday, but I think most of them we've covered that are required. So, all right, see you guys on Thursday.
Professor?
Yeah, what's up?
Is there some problem? I think there's some problem with my grade for homework 1. Like if I click this link.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. So like I'm doing the extra credit portion here.
Yep. Cool.
Yeah. And I got
so you just didn't assign you the extra credit.
Yeah.
Cool. Can you submit a regrade request? So if you have Slack, there's a link at the top of the channel, or it's in the syllabus. Just fill out that regrade request, and then I'll take a look at it from there.
Sure.
Because yeah, we can totally fix that. For whatever reason, they just didn't give you the.
So it's here, right?
Yep.
Wait a second.
So if you go to General.
General.
And then scroll to the top. Sorry, go all the way to the top.
All the way to the top.
Oh, or you're in the last semesters.
Huh?
Oh, that's last semester's Slack room.
Okay.
Somewhere I forgot to update a link. But you might want to look for the new link for this semester. Or it's in the syllabus too. So if you pull up the syllabus, there's a link to the regrade form. Go to like files, and then in there that top one. Or, yeah, that one there. That's
That one.
Yep.
Okay, let's see.
And then if you scroll down to regrades.
Oh, here.
Yeah, there you go. So fill out that form, and we'll get it taken care of.
Okay, can I? Oh, just fill out for here is fine,
Yep.
right?
There are no bonus. Yep, yeah, it looks great. Just make sure you have all of there's some required elements that you have to have. Make sure you have all of those. Yeah. Should be.
Okay. I've already submitted that.
Okay, awesome. We'll handle it for you. Oh, interesting. I haven't seen that done before. Oh, yeah. If it works, that's fine. We're not really grading your CSS this time, so should be good to go. Let's go.
The last one, like part of the assignment was to center the text, and I found online you can just use like a closing and opening center tag around it, but it said that wasn't the best way to do it. Is there a better way?
Yeah, so the better way to do with CSS, we use text-align property. So we'll say text-align center.
Right.
And that will say, it basically does the same thing, except instead of having to have an extra tag, we apply that to any tag.
Right, so then you're not using the HTML.
Exactly. Yep, no problem.